She was 9 years old when the letter came, written in ink that had barely dried, sealed with a symbol she didn't recognize, 2 lions flanking a crown. Her name was there, misspelled, but her father recognized the insignia. His hands trembled when he read it. The palace had chosen her. She was to be brought to the Imperial court for education and service, a phrase that sounded polite, almost honorable, until you understood what it really meant. Girls like her weren't called up for education. They were chosen for obedience, for grooming, for quietness. They were chosen to become ornaments, property, sometimes worse. And so, without ceremony, she was taken. This wasn't unusual. By the 17th century, courts from Istanbul to Versailles to Mughal Delhi operated on a kind of brutal efficiency: collect beauty, discipline it, and use it. Girls, usually between 8 and 12, were gathered from noble families, foreign courts, even as tribute from vassal states. Some were gifted, some sold. Some were taken with words like honor and promotion. But the outcome was always the same. They were brought to the palace, stripped of their past, renamed and trained. That word, trained, carried weight. It meant ritualized grooming, silence, compliance. In the Ottoman harem, for example, girls underwent a strict regimen of body control, language instruction, and posture correction. In France, they were coached on perfume, etiquette, dance, and the art of flattery. In the Persian Safavid court, eunuchs inspected them for symmetry and scent, as one record chillingly puts it. One Persian court physician wrote in 1623, "A young girl should be clean, still, and without question. The best are those who do not remember where they came from," and most didn't, because they were not meant to. She arrived at the palace just before winter. The marble was cold beneath her feet. The halls were too wide, every sound echoed. The older girls didn't speak to her. The matrons told her to keep her arms at her sides, her eyes lowered, her steps light. She was bathed until her skin burned, scrubbed with salt and perfumed oils, her hair cut, then tied with a father anymore. You belong to the court. And so she learned not to ask. The training was relentless. Each morning began before sunrise. She was taught how to walk slowly, to sit without creasing her gown, to pour tea without sound. One mistake meant no breakfast, 2 meant beatings, not with sticks, but with silence. She would be locked in a stone corridor and made to stand until nightfall. She was not allowed to cry, only to memorize which spoon to use for fruit, which perfume to wear for which royal guest, how to press her lips without smiling, how to speak in whispers even when no one was around. She was taught which foods made the skin glow, which herbs softened the body. One older girl whispered that drinking crushed pearls would make you more attractive. It didn't matter if it worked. It mattered that she believed it did. Because that belief, that her worth depended on pleasing someone else, was the core of everything. And then came the dress. The first real sign that her training was nearly complete. Silk from Aleppo, embroidery from Delhi, heavy with golden thread, so weighty she could barely move. But that was the point. Movement was no longer hers, comfort no longer hers. She was no longer hers. The dress was a costume, and she was the performance. Girls like her rarely made it into the history books. They were nameless, silent, referred to only as ladies in waiting, attendants, or gifts. But behind the titles were human beings, children, who had been shaped into symbols of control. They didn't just serve pleasure, they embodied power. One Ottoman vizier recorded in a private journal, "The girls are not women, they are mirrors. The Sultan sees in them his strength, his order, his ownership." He wasn't exaggerating. To own the most beautiful, the most obedient, the most envied girl, this was how kings displayed their control, not just over her body, but over their court, their enemies, and their own image. And when that girl had been groomed since childhood, that was the deepest form of conquest. By the end of her first year, she had stopped asking questions. She knew the names of every wife, concubine, and chamber eunuch. She could kneel without her knees cracking, sit for hours without blinking. She knew what oils to burn in the presence of grief, what songs to sing when the emperor was angry. She had not seen the sky in weeks, but she had memorized the ceiling patterns of every royal room. Some girls disappeared. taken, reassigned, or simply broken, their names erased from the servant lists. One girl, barely 11, refused to bow low enough and was reassigned to the linen rooms. Another, too outspoken, was beaten until her jaw shifted permanently. The girl learned from all of them. She bowed deeper, spoke less, smiled only when told, and eventually, the summons came. Not to serve tea, not to pour wine, but to entertain. It would begin with music, the matron said. Then incense. Then whatever the royals requested. No questions, no refusal, just obedience. The girl did not nod. She simply stood, because she had been trained not to say yes, only not to say no. There was no curtain, no audience, at least not one that clapped. But every evening in the palace was a performance, and she was the centerpiece. She had been trained for this, to glide rather than walk, to stand so still she might be mistaken for a statue. Her dress whispered as she moved, embroidered so densely that it weighed almost as much as she did. The music played, and she stepped forward, not because she wanted to, not because she understood, but because she had been taught, repeatedly, that her body was no longer her own. In the royal courts of empires like the Ottoman Mughal and Safavid, entire evenings were structured around what the records called entertainments. The word sounds gentle, harmless, but behind it lay a complicated, suffocating architecture of ritualized control. A sultan or emperor might summon girls, often dozens at a time, for dancing, music, or simply to watch them eat. In some cases, the girls would be expected to reenact courtly dramas or ancient myths, playing the role of goddesses, muses, or silent queens. One 17th century Persian chronicle described a harem banquet. The girls appeared in veils of silver thread, each bearing a fruit. They were not to speak unless commanded. The favored one of the evening would receive a ring or a bite of the sultan's own meat. A bite of meat. This was the reward. There were dozens of others, some older, some even younger. They were not friends, not truly. The system didn't allow for trust. At any moment, one of them could be chosen. And to be chosen meant favor. It meant gifts, it meant survival, or ruin. Because royal attention was not affection. It was scrutiny, it was risk. If you said the wrong word, tripped, showed fear, you could be dismissed, or punished, or worse, forgotten. And in the palace, being forgotten was the slowest form of death. So the girls competed, not openly, not with words, but with posture, scent, stillness. They memorized the ruler's moods, learned which spices to use as perfume, which tones to hum in which corridors. They practiced smiling without teeth, glancing up just long enough to flatter, never long enough to challenge. And the eunuchs watched everything. They were the silent gatekeepers of this world. Men who had been surgically altered, sometimes as children, to ensure loyalty and prevent contamination. They organized the schedules, enforced the rules, and reminded the girls, daily, of their place. A Persian eunuch's ledger from 1654 includes chilling details. Girl 18th stood too close to the Shah, assigned to kitchen duties. Girl 3rd cried in public, punished with fasting. Girl 27th bloomed early, scheduled for selection. They weren't names, they were numbers. One night the girl made a mistake. She looked up, too soon, too directly. The prince had laughed at something, and she'd forgotten herself. Her gaze had risen, catching his eye. He said nothing. But the matron noticed. The next morning, she was assigned to ash-sweeping duty. Her silks replaced with rough cloth, her hands blistered after only an hour. She was not told how long the punishment would last, because the palace didn't need to punish with words, it punished with forgetting. And still she stayed. What choice did she have? Her family was gone, her name changed, her old language was discouraged. She was reminded again and again that the palace had saved her, that she had been chosen. The phrase was everywhere. You are fortunate, you live in gold, others live in mud. She learned not to question it. Because questioning wasn't just forbidden, it was unimaginable. Some girls escaped, but not by running. They escaped by disappearing into the system. They became favorites, concubines, even royal mothers if they bore a son. One girl, barely 15, caught the attention of a Mughal prince and became his companion for 5 years. When he died, she was sent to a widow's house, her jewelry taken, her hair cut. Another girl rose higher. She memorized Persian poetry, wrote letters for the Shah, and eventually wielded quiet influence over diplomatic visitors. But even she was never free, because elevation in the palace was just a higher shelf on the same locked cabinet. One diary fragment from an Armenian nun visiting the Safavid court in 1679 records a rare moment of private conversation with one of the palace girls. She said she had forgotten her own voice, that the only sound she trusted anymore was footsteps, that she dreamed nightly of doorways that led nowhere. The girl listening to this, back in the corner of the marble room, said nothing. But she understood, because she had stopped dreaming months ago. That night she was called forward, no reason given. A eunuch whispered her name, her new name, the one the court had given her, and she followed, down a corridor lit with red oil lamps, past girls who looked away, past guards who didn't move. She didn't ask where she was going, because she already knew. She had been trained for this. The door opened, and she stepped into the room, silk heavy on her shoulders. The stage was marble, and her silence was the price. It started with a glance. Not a command, not a gesture, just a slow, deliberate glance from the man seated on the raised platform, draped in brocade and gold. He was surrounded by musicians, guards, whispering advisors, but when his eyes met hers, the room fell quiet. No one gasped, no one spoke. But every girl in the hall understood what had just happened. She had been chosen. Being chosen was supposed to be the goal. It was what all the training led to. The perfect walk, the subtle smile, the ability to hold a gaze just long enough to seem respectful but never long enough to challenge. Girls were groomed to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to remain calm even when touched, to please silently. And once chosen, the rewards came quickly. New dresses, jewels, a private chamber with cushions instead of straw, servants who bowed to her instead of ignoring her. She was allowed to eat first. She was allowed to speak. She was even, rarely, allowed to laugh. But power in a royal court is never given freely. It's loaned, and always at interest. Being favored meant exposure, jealousy, isolation. The other girls, once silent companions, became wary, distant. The matrons were stricter, the eunuchs harsher. Every word she said was written down, every object she touched inspected. Her body, once a subject of training, was now an asset. She was paraded before ambassadors, dressed to impress visiting dignitaries. Rumors circled that she might be elevated to official companion. One noble wrote in a letter, "The little gazelle from the eastern quarters now sits beside the throne. She is graceful. But one wrong blink, and she'll be thrown into the garden like spoiled fruit." That wasn't hyperbole. Girls who fell from favor weren't dismissed politely. They were sent away, silently. Sometimes to remote country estates, sometimes to the kitchens, sometimes to graves that no one marked. But for now she was rising. She was assigned a tutor, to improve her reading, to compose poetry. Her accent was softened, her hair dyed to match court fashion. She was taught chess, strategy, how to fold letters with no seal, and still make them binding. She was being shaped into more than a servant. She was being turned into a political tool. This happened across empires. In the Ottoman palace, favorites became Khedin, a rank just beneath queen consort. In the Mughal harem, some women wrote letters in the emperor's name. In Persia, the Shah's chosen girls sometimes spoke in council, through veils behind screens, but their influence was real. And yet, behind the layers of silk and protocol, the truth remained unchanged. Their value was tethered to someone else's desire. To please was to survive. To fail was to vanish. She began to see it differently now. The smiles weren't affection. The gifts weren't generosity. Every necklace was a leash, every bracelet a shackle. Her chamber, though larger, had no windows. Her guards were closer now, not fewer. Her daily schedule included perfuming, language lessons, and rehearsals for how to greet the royal mother. Not because they cared about her growth, because she was a reflection of the court. A mirror polished until it forgot it was glass. One day, a foreign envoy arrived from across the sea. She was instructed to attend the feast, to wear blue, to say nothing. At dinner, the envoy complimented her eyes. She smiled, politely. Later that night she was summoned again, not by the Sultan this time but by his brother. She refused, politely, a silent bow, averted eyes. The next morning her tutor was gone. Her chamber was moved back near the laundry quarters. Her breakfast was late, and the message was clear. Obedience wasn't just expected, it was enforced by withdrawal, isolation, a slow unraveling of everything she had been given. But she didn't cry, because she had learned something the others hadn't. She had learned to watch, to count the patterns, the rhythms, who ate where, which eunuchs reported to which scribes. She watched who delivered food, who burned letters, who entered the vizier's quarters after midnight. She began to see the court for what it was, not a prison, a game. And every game has rules, even if they aren't written. One night, a different visitor arrived, older, stern, a regional governor known for cruelty. She was told to attend, alone. Instead, she sent a note, not to him, to the Queen Mother. A verse of poetry, a line about loyalty, a subtle reminder of the power women held, not in public, but behind the screens. And it worked. The Queen Mother sent for her, spoke to her finally directly. And the next day, her tutor returned, her chamber was restored, and her name was added to the list of trusted companions, not just of the Sultan, but of the women who truly ran the court, because behind every throne were voices, and behind every voice was a girl who had learned from age 9 that her silence had value, but her cleverness could be worth even more. Years passed, not that she counted them, not out loud at least, but her face had changed, her hands steadier, her movements slower. The newest batch of girls, brought in at 9 and 10, looked at her the way she had once looked at the older girls, with curiosity, envy, and a little fear. They whispered that she had once served beside the throne, that the Queen Mother trusted her, that the scribes consulted her when palace rituals were changed. All of it was true, and none of it was safe, because even now, even after everything she knew, there was no such thing as safety here, only usefulness. And one day, your usefulness ran out. She had seen it happen dozens of times. Girls who were praised one day and vanished the next, who stepped out of line, sometimes literally, and were never seen again. One girl spoke too loudly, another laughed at the wrong time, another asked about her family. Gone, gone, gone. Each disappearance taught a lesson, each silence reinforced the rules, and she had learned them all. But she had also learned something else, that inside the palace, power didn't always sit on a throne. It didn't come with titles or feasts. Real power lived in memory, in the quiet nods between women, in the patterns remembered, in the names never spoken aloud. The ones who survived longest weren't the most beautiful, or even the most obedient. They were the ones who had learned to see. She had seen things that never made it into the records. She saw a servant boy slip a poisoned fig onto a platter, saw a concubine smuggle a letter to her sister sewn into a hem. She saw the Queen Mother weep once, only once, when news came that her youngest son had died. She never spoke of these things, but she remembered them, and in doing so, she preserved a world that was never meant to be remembered. Eventually, she stopped being summoned. She stopped performing. She became what the palace called a silent matron, a woman too old to serve, too clever to dismiss, still robed in silk, still addressed with formality, but never called to the grand halls. Instead, she sat in the garden, tended the small fig trees, watched the next generation arrive, and wondered what they had been promised. History rarely records women like her. The chronicles are full of kings and wars, treaties and triumphs. But behind every page, behind every empire, were girls taken young and taught to smile through silence. Girls who were told their pain was a gift, their obedience a virtue. Girls who had no choice but to survive beautifully. And some did. Some rose high, became royal mothers, became advisors behind veils. Some left the palace with land, wealth, even poems written in their names. Others didn't. Others bled quietly, faded, vanished. But all of them were part of the system. A system that required them to be silent, so others could speak. She stayed until her hair turned silver, until the newer girls no longer asked her questions, until the queen mother died and the prince became king and the eunuchs changed uniforms and the marble walls were washed and painted again. And still, she sat in the garden, remembering. Because there was no one else left to. One morning she found a fig beneath the tree, perfectly ripe, soft, sweet. She plucked it, pressed it between her fingers, and thought of the girl who had once arrived with salt on her skin and questions in her throat. She thought of how far that girl had come, not free, but alive, and that, in a place like this, was its own kind of rebellion. So no, she didn't write a history. There are no statues in her name. But if you listen closely in the records, between the lines of the eunuch's ledgers, the sultan's decrees, the queen mother's letters, you'll find her in the silences, in the gaps, in the quiet proof that obedience was never the whole story. Because sometimes survival isn't about escaping the palace. It's about remembering what the palace tried to erase,